from North Carolina. Today, he's a Cup Series champion.
He's in! Patriots win the Super Bowl! Brady has his 5th! What a comeback!
Bases loaded. 2 out. Hard hit into right. Back at the wall. Tie game! Big Papi!
Back to Iguodala. Up for the layup. Oh, blocked by James. LeBron James with the rejection.
45. There goes Davis.
Oh, my God.
Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game. He ran the missed field goal back.
Is insane. How do you make that catch?
Oh my goodness. This is sick. Put this to music. I don't think he stepped out either. That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen.
Number 39.
Do it. Pass is caught. Diggs! Sideline! Touchdown! Unbelievable! Vikings win it!
Welcome to All Sports, All Talk. I'm your host, Jay Stabono, and I'm here with Jeff Benedict, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Tiger and the Dynasty. He's joining us today on his book tour for the just-released LEBRON, the biography of one of the greatest athletes of all time. Jeff, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My first question for you, Jeff. You were a Waterford native and went to Waterford High School. The first piece you ever wrote was for the school newspaper. Did you always know you wanted to be a writer, and what were your aspirations growing up?
That's a good one. Also making me feel old. Yeah, the first thing I ever had published was in the school newspaper. I was a freshman at Waterford High, and the school paper at the time was more like, it was a class. I took it as a class. And it really wasn't much of a paper, but you know, I went on it to cover sports for Waterford High. But right when I started, John Lennon was assassinated. I'm a huge music fan, love music.
Yeah.
And so I went to my teacher at the high school and I asked if I could write about John Lennon's death, and she said yes. And so the first thing I ever wrote was about that. And I never thought, at that time, to be honest with you, I was definitely not thinking about being a writer. In high school, I never thought of writing as a career.
Yeah.
I thought of it as something that you have to do to get a grade in that particular class.
Yeah.
But I loved writing that piece about John Lennon, and then I actually did write a few football stories about the Lancers that year. But again, never thought about it as a job.
Yeah, I definitely same way. I do it just for a grade. But the older I've gotten, I've definitely realized that I could definitely be doing something with the writing and with sports. So
it is I think when you're a teenager, in my case at least, most kids don't think of writing as a profession.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's other things that seem cooler.
Yeah.
Or more exciting.
Yeah.
Like being an athlete.
Yeah.
Or being an actor, or a doctor, or a lawyer, all these other things. But writing is a great profession. There aren't many people actually do it for a living.
Yeah.
But I have done it for a living, and it's been a great occupation.
I know you've met a lot of famous people, from musicians to athletes, billionaires, presidential candidates, but who was the most interesting figure you've met?
That's a hard one. I don't know if I could say one person, because I have met a lot of really interesting people over the years. I wrote a book about a guy whose job is to study ancient skeletons. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he literally goes on excavations and looks at skeletons that are 10,000 years old or older. And I would say he was probably one of the most fascinating humans I've ever been around. My oldest son, Tennyson, who was at the time was like, I think he was 6 or 7, and he loved things like dinosaurs and archaeology, and so I bought him like an archaeologist hat at the Smithsonian, and I took him with me on when I would go with this guy who worked at the Smithsonian, and we went on some, like, I want to say excavations together, but we were able to take Tennyson out in the field a little bit. And for Tennyson, it was a little bit like going with Indiana Jones. But to be honest, it was like that for me too. And when I say writing's a great occupation, the truth is that it's because you get to meet people that do really interesting things.
Yeah, definitely. I think you, I mean, just from the books you've wrote and the signings that I've been to in past years, like, you have met some incredible individuals and just some people that everybody looks up to. So
and they're all different. Like, I've never really been impressed by celebrity or anything like that. I just think that I am impressed though with people who do things that are different or unique, or perhaps they do something better than everybody else, and which makes them worthy of like writing a book about.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I've learned just from all the books that you have wrote about the athletes, like they have like crazy stories. I know, for example, the Steve Young book that you had made, I remember the whole story with like him in the hotel room the night before the NFC Championship. And I know you would, obviously you detailed that in your book very well. So, and I remember watching the film, The Football Life, that you made, and with the NFL Network and all that. That was very cool. That was one of my favorite story, because I'm obviously a huge sports fan, but football is like just my main thing.
Right.
And I'll never forget going to that book signing. Two. I went to two, and one of them, it was for my birthday, and you had him right inside of it, which was one of the craziest experiences ever for me.
Because you got to meet him.
Yeah, and then the second one, I remember I brought a football. And I remember, like, he literally taught me his hand, like how he would hold the football and throw it. And I haven't let that go since this day. Ever since I left that bookshop, I've thrown a football the same way he's always taught me.
So great.
Yeah, and I'm expecting this LEBRON book. I can't wait to learn about everything with him. Obviously, he's constantly, everybody's always talking about him, whether it's the GOAT debate or what he continues to do off the court and on the court. He's a huge influence. He's probably the biggest influence in professional sports right now, considering Tom Brady's retired.
Right. You have to say that New England.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Tom Brady might not be retired for long. I see, I think every day I see something that says he's coming out of retirement soon, but I think this one's official.
Yeah. I think there's people who want him to come out.
Yeah.
My favorite story was Steve Young. That's something that I have no trouble picking that out, because going back to Waterford High School days, when I was in high school, Steve was in college.
Yeah.
And Steve's from Connecticut. He grew up in Greenwich. And so when I was at Waterford High School, I would watch Steve's college games on my couch on Shore Road in Connecticut, and he was as a boy, he was someone that I looked up to a lot, because I was the only Mormon boy at Waterford High School at that time when I entered the high school, and Steve was a Mormon, and so I was very well aware of who he was, and he was also like the only Mormon that was sort of mainstream and respected because of his great athletic ability. And so I respected and looked up to that, because he was like the only one that I could point to and say, like, you're proud to be associated with that. Fast forward a whole bunch of years, right? Steve plays 15, 16 years in the NFL, retires. I then become a writer. I write for 15 years or whatever. And then one day, I'm writing a story for Sports Illustrated, and I asked Steve for an interview. And I'd actually never met Steve. That was a really odd thing. Is our paths had never crossed all those years. So I did the interview with him for this piece I was writing, which wasn't about him. It was about a different athlete. At the end of that interview, he asked me if I would be interested in helping him write his life story.
Yeah.
That's how it all started. But here's the thing that I remember as my favorite part of that whole project was near the end when we were making the documentary for NFL Films, which was based on the book. He and I went to Candlestick Park, and Candlestick Park was being demolished. Like literally there were wrecking balls there and cranes, and parts of the stadium had been smashed to pieces. And here we are, and NFL Films camera guys like, Steve, we want to get you throwing some spirals, because they were going to have him throw, and then they were going to cut to that pass where Terrell Owens is catching it in the end zone. And they were like, we need someone to catch the ball. And I was like, I'll do that. And I went down to the end zone and stood right where Terrell caught the ball. And I was sitting there thinking, like, wow, I'm about to catch a pass from Steve Young.
Yeah.
And to me, and I did, and I actually have to admit, I actually got a little nervous before he threw it, because I thought, this is going to be really embarrassing if I don't catch this. And I know how to catch a football, but in that moment I was thinking I'll probably like forget and fumble. But that to me was like, I mean, that's what I say about how exciting writing can be. Like, to having an experience like that, which I never would have had if I hadn't have been a decent writer. Because the writing is what gave me the opportunity to have that moment in my life. And when we were standing there and I was waiting, I was looking up, there were some seagulls overhead. It was a perfect blue sky day in San Francisco, and I was thinking, man, when I was in high school, I would have never dreamed that one day I would be standing in Candlestick Park with cranes and wrecking balls, catching a pass from Steve Young.
Yeah.
If you'd have told me that, I would have said, you're out of your mind.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And I think, like, through you and just meeting you and learning about all the books you've wrote, and, you know, even meeting like Steve Young, Kyle Van Noy, like, I think that has developed me as a sports fan too, just learning about these stories. And obviously now I feel like sports is mostly my life. Like, that's what I love to do, is just, you know, watch and just, you know, elaborate about what I'm seeing and just, you know, talk about my opinions on stuff like that. And I think even just with meeting Kyle Van Noy and Steve Young, who both went to BYU, and Kyle Van Noy has a crazy story as well. But like, I think even now, I know I have a BYU sweatshirt in my house right now, and I would not have a BYU sweatshirt in my house if it wasn't, you know, for learning about, you know, the
Kyle.
people that you know, and of course Kyle, yeah.
No, that was great when Kyle, I was so excited because I met Kyle when Kyle had just finished his sophomore year of college at BYU, and I was working on a book called The System at the time, and about college football, and I wanted to find an athlete who, going into their junior year of college, was potentially going to be good enough that they could declare early for the draft and skip their senior year. And Kyle was one of probably, maybe 10 players in the country that were in that category, and he was the only one that I had an into. And so I didn't know Kyle, but I knew someone who did. And so I went to Kyle and I approached him about allowing me to shadow him through his junior year and profile him in this book. And that turned out to be not only a wonderful experience, because Kyle's a wonderful human being, but it led to a great friendship. And then when he ended up in New England with the Patriots, by that time I was writing the Dynasty. And so that was fantastic because, it gave me a chance to sort of see him go like full circle.
Yeah, I mean, and it's crazy too hearing that story just about how he was like one of 10 juniors declaring for the draft, because one of the things that I love most, and it's probably my favorite thing, is the NFL draft. And just from then till now, like now it's all juniors and even some redshirt sophomores. Like it'd be a lot more rare to find a senior, even though obviously seniors definitely declare, but like most of the draft is filled with juniors and redshirt sophomores even.
Right.
So
Right.
that's, it's crazy.
Well, then he decided not to. Like, he was going to come out early, and then I think he made a really smart decision, which was to stay in for a senior year and actually finish the 4 years at BYU and then come out. And I remember being surprised when Kyle did that, but I thought he did the right thing.
Yeah, I think that was definitely the right thing then because, of course, there was only 10 kids declaring. I think, I always felt like, unless you're, like, you're guaranteed to be, like, you're going to get a lot of money and you're going to get drafted highly, I've always felt that, staying for your senior year is obviously a huge risk. You risk, getting hurt. You risk, maybe some other guys in the next year's class, just being better and just getting more love from the NFL and the media. So, it's obviously a huge risk, but I've always felt like I know personally for the NBA, you can declare from college after 1 year. And I do not like that rule at all. Like I've always, I remember.
It's the LeBron rule.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I always, know that just from my time, like I remember a couple years ago, or even more than a couple years ago now, with Duke, they had like Zion Williamson, RJ Barrett. They had one of the best teams ever,
Right.
but they all declared after their first year.
That's right.
And, it's just, I remember that year, which was why it made me upset and why I don't like the rule is because Zion, who was the most exciting player in college, as a kid growing up, seeing him in college, like you would recreate his dunks on like mini hoop basketball hoops if you could. And him, he obviously got hurt and missed most of that college season.
Right.
And, I always just remember that I felt like we had kind of missed out on an experience, and I wish we had gotten to see more time from them. So maybe I was just a little bit disappointed, and that's why my opinions are the way they are, just about the draft and how much, how many years of college you have to go to. But that's, but it's just crazy how things have changed. Just 10 juniors and now it's filled with juniors.
Yeah. I think that the thing about Zion that's interesting is all these young players that declare early and come out, and I understand why they do it. It's a really glaring illustration of why LeBron is so unusual.
Yeah.
All these guys that come out of college early with so much hype and expectation around them, they don't live up to it. It doesn't really matter what the reasons are, injuries, whatever.
Yeah.
Point is LeBron is really the only player you can point to who's actually, LeBron had more hype than all those guys combined, and he actually exceeded all the hype that was around him. Most guys don't do that. They come in with a lot of hype and they never meet the expectation that's been placed on them. And I think what makes LeBron's story so extraordinary is that he had more hype than even, like, people forget that Michael Jordan didn't have a lot of hype coming out of high school. He wasn't scrutinized the way LeBron is. He wasn't compared to, say, Bill Russell when he was in high school. Like, he's going to be the next Oscar Robertson or something. Like, that didn't happen to Jordan. Whereas when LeBron was in high school, at age 15 and 16, he was being compared to, supposed to be the future Michael Jordan, which is, in a way, like a terrible burden to put on a kid. But he actually lived up to it. And that's, I think, why he is such an outlier in sports today.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to take away. I know you had a question.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Since this is obviously a sports podcast, I'd like to know, what is the best sports experience you've personally ever had?
Sports experience?
Yeah.
Like outside of writing?
Yeah.
Probably taking my two sons when they were really little to Fenway Park, 2004, in the playoffs against the Yankees, when it looked like it was over because the Yankees had gotten, way up in the series, and the series was over, and the Red Sox came back. And I was at the game with my two sons, the game that went 13 innings, and it felt like 6 hours. Fenway literally was out of concessions. You couldn't even find water bottles. And I remember I had my littlest boy on my shoulders, Clancy. My other son, Tennyson, was there with his best friend and his dad. I have never had that much fun at a sporting event in my life. Yeah. And when the Red Sox came back and won that game against the Yankees, I knew this was a moment like that with my sons that would be something we'd talk about the rest of our lives. That's the great thing about sports. In any country you're in, it doesn't matter. It could be, soccer in South America. It could be a bullfight in Spain. It could be a baseball game in America. But it's a venue where you can have moments like that with your dad, with a parent, with a friend that for the rest of your life you remember where you were when this happened.
Yeah.
And for me, it was that game. It was the Red Sox and the Yankees, David Ortiz, being so thirsty we couldn't find water. And I remember when the game was over, those poor, like McDonald's and all the other places around Fenway Park were literally mobbed when the game was over, because it was like this stampede of people coming out of Fenway, and everybody was hungry and thirsty, but everybody was exuberant and thrilled because of the game that we just witnessed. That would be it for me.
I think, just from my perspective, just growing up, I've had a realization of those moments that I remember, and it's fitting because I was just talking about this with my friend the other day. We were going to Fenway for opening day, and we were talking about where we were when LeBron James had the 3-1 comeback, where we were when he makes that block, and obviously everybody knows that. And I remember I was in my mom's bedroom, and I was young, so it was just me, my mom, my sister, my dad, all in her bed, and we were watching it. And I just, that's a moment that I'll never forget. I'll always remember Super Bowl 51, the Patriots' huge comeback. That's another one of those moments I can't even put to words, because I
remember that because I watched that game with you.
Yeah, and that was probably the greatest sporting event I've ever seen. I remember being so upset, so mad. I
think your mom went to bed because she knew it was over.
I was gonna say, I can tell you pretty much everything that happened in that fourth quarter. I remember it so vividly.
That's great.
I remember she did go. My mom went to her bedroom, and she stayed up there, and they started coming back, and we were like, "Oh, this is a good luck charm."
Didn't someone tell her to stay up there?
Yeah, I'm sure. And I was young, but I was a diehard. This was if they lost, I wasn't going to school the next day. So it was just, I remember after looking at my iPad that was charging and seeing a text from my friend who happened to be a Steelers fan, and he texted, it was from 3 hours earlier, and it was this ain't looking good. And I just texted back, and I was like, how's it looking now? And I just remember so much, but it was one of the craziest nights of my life. And then I'd say the moment I remember just from being in person was my favorite current Patriot right now, Kendrick Bourne, his 75-yard touchdown against Dallas was we
pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I was there. And I ended up getting on TV that game with my friend, and but I remember how it was the environment inside the stadium. I've never been in something so loud. Cowboys fans next to me were distraught. It was, and everybody was on their feet. I remember. It was crazy. It was a crazy moment.
I was at the game with my son.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. I think for fathers and sons, and it's sports provide. Sometimes it's It's the only time fathers and sons can communicate well. You know, it's like, because at a sporting event, you don't need to have communication skills.
Yeah.
You just need to be together.
Yeah.
And you find yourself rooting for the same thing. And that's the other thing I do like about sports so much, is you can be in a stadium with a lot of people that are really different than you. They could be from a different economic class than you are. They could be a different race than you are. They could be a different age than you are. They could look entirely different than you, but for 3 hours in the stadium, you're all on the same team. And there aren't many places in American culture where you can create that kind of environment. It's one of the reasons that, I mean, I don't really consider myself a sports writer per se, but when I have the opportunity to write books that are about sports or athletes, that's one of the things that I always like about the process, is that feeling you get in the ballpark, which is really, it's inspiring. It's different. It's like, in a way, it's a substitute for religion. You know, I know it's not religion, but it's like going to a different church.
Yeah.
You know, it's like everybody there is feeling the same sense of inspiration, and everybody's pulling together, and it's like a big, massive community. And it's like you set all the political differences and all the other stuff that divide us, you put all that aside when you're in there. And I like that. Like, I wish there were more ways in the country that we could do that.
Yeah.
But at least sports does that. And,
Yeah.
In fact, in the LeBron book, that's one of the things that I like about LeBron's story is, you know, you see that. LeBron learns that early when he goes to a Jewish community center as a young kid and starts going to basketball clinics with a Jewish coach who's teaching basically what amount to a bunch of white kids that go to this clinic on Sunday nights. When LeBron and a couple of his friends start going, they're the only African American kids in the clinic. They stand out because of that. But it's almost like really rapidly that evaporates, and there's a unification of the kids that are there, the coach, and the great thing is that Jewish coach ends up getting hired by a private Catholic school in Akron, and then LeBron and his friends go to that school to play for that coach. And so it's like you have, you know, 4 African American kids go to a private Catholic school to play for a Jewish coach. And I ended one of the chapters with that little nugget, because it's just, without saying it, you see the way sports brings people together, and it's pretty nice.
Yeah. So I've heard some stories, but I was wondering, what is the craziest thing you personally have had to do to get a story for a book you've wanted to write, or?
How do you define crazy?
Like, out of the ordinary, like something that
That doesn't count, because everything in this job is out of the ordinary. Give me a better thing than that.
Something that most people, like, something that you would say is different from what you've had to do to get your other stories.
Well, I was working on I got hired by the Los Angeles Times to do a story on Kobe Bryant, and it was when Kobe was getting ready to go to trial, criminal trial, in Colorado, and the judge in that case had sealed all the records in the case, and so no journalist was allowed to. We couldn't get access to the police reports, to anything, and I knew who the various people were that actually had access. And like other journalists at the time, we were asking to see the documents, and of course being told no. And I actually went on a trip across the country to each of the places where I knew there was someone who had access to the records. And I ultimately ended up in Los Angeles. That was my last stop. And there was someone there that I had arranged to meet with who had the documents. And this person reached out to me when I was there and instructed me to meet him in a hotel room that was in the same hotel that I was staying in. And when I went there was a couple of big 3-ring binders on a desk in the room, in the hotel room. And he told me that I had, a certain amount of time where I could look through them. And I, of course, would prefer to get some copies, but that wasn't going to be allowed. So I had a notepad and I took it out, and I started to make some notes of what I was seeing in the documents. I was seeing the police reports, and I was also seeing the medical records that belonged to the woman who claimed that she'd been assaulted from the hospital. And those are definitely confidential. And so I was making some notes, and the person goes, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm assuming you're not going to let me take pictures or make copies of these, so I'm making some notes." He said, "I don't want you doing that." And I said, "Well, I have to have some proof of what's in these documents." And he told me that he wanted me to, he wanted my notebook. Mm-hmm. And I said, "I'm not going to give you my notebook." And he actually placed a handgun on the table next to me, which was very intimidating. Yeah. And I'm not going to say that I was like afraid that something like lethal was going to happen, but it was just the environment of having a weapon. I don't like guns. Yeah. And I don't own any guns. Yeah. I don't like them. And having one next to me on the table was very unsettling, to say the least. And so I said to him that I'm not going to give you my notebook, but I will tear the page off and you can follow me into the bathroom. I'll crumple it up and flush it down the toilet. And he did follow me into the restroom in his room, and I did crumple it up and flush it down the toilet in front of him. When I went back to my room, the closest thing I had to evidence of what I had seen in the record, other than my memory, was the indentation in the next sheet of paper in the pad from what I had used, because I pressed down really hard when I write. But one of the things I had to do is when I ran back to my room, I took my laptop out and I, feverishly sort of typed everything that I could remember that I saw in the report. I had looked at a lot of sexual assault complaints because I actually studied and used to, as a young lawyer, I even worked in a district attorney's office and prosecuted sex crimes. So I was very familiar with rape kits and sexual assault complaints. I knew what to look for in those documents, and I zeroed in on some key language that I was looking for, and that was the stuff that I sort of keyed in on my laptop. But I would say that experience was probably one of the most unusual in terms of, just circumstances as a journalist. I don't really do stuff like that anymore. When you're writing biographies, that was when I was doing a lot of more investigative work. And as a biographer, you have to do a lot of research, but it's different than that. And honestly, like at this stage in my life, I like doing biographies.
Yeah. I could imagine after that. I know for myself, I just get unsettled going into close spaces. So that would have, my heart rate would have been through the roof. But.
Well, after that story came out, I initially wrote a story for 3 stories for Sports Illustrated, and the judge who had sealed the records held a closed door hearing with all of the lawyers on both sides, and he basically went down the row and asked everybody who leaked the documents. Mm-hmm. The lawyers involved actually tried to get Time Inc., which owns Sports Illustrated, to get me to turn over my notes. And of course, the lawyer at the magazine told me, at this point, turn over nothing but save everything. Mm-hmm. And I remember that was a pretty hairy, that whole experience was pretty hairy. But it was an important story, and there were a couple people who got in trouble for providing me those documents. I didn't get in trouble because I hadn't done anything wrong. Yeah. I was just doing my job. Yeah. But the court order had been violated, no question. Mm-hmm. And so.
All right. Well, Jeff, this is great. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I wish you good luck with your LeBron book and everything in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.